Most people never question the systems they inherit, especially when those systems come clothed in religious language and centuries of tradition. One of the most entrenched examples of this is the idea of tithing, the belief that every believer must give 10% of their income to the church or face divine disapproval. It's presented not as a suggestion, but as a requirement, a divine commandment fixed and non-negotiable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. God never said that. Not to you, not to the modern church, not under the covenant you now live by. What makes this conversation difficult is that tithing has become more than a practice. It's become a litmus test of faithfulness, a measure of obedience, even a justification for prosperity. And for many, questioning it feels like heresy. But intellectual and spiritual maturity demands that we don't just believe, we understand. We don't just repeat, we examine, especially when a teaching affects people's sense of worth, their financial well-being, and their relationship with God. So this is not a call to stop giving, far from it. This is a call to reframe what giving actually means, to move beyond obligation, beyond manipulation, and into something deeper, freer, more authentically human and divine. The goal here is not rebellion, it's clarity. To distinguish between what God has truly asked of us and what human institutions have insisted on in His name. Because when fear, guilt, or tradition become substitutes for understanding, spiritual life begins to decay. It becomes performative, hollow, and that's not the kind of faith Christ died to offer us. So let's ask the hard questions. Let's trace the origin of the tithe. Let's look at what Jesus really said and didn't say. Let's expose the psychological and institutional dynamics that have turned a symbolic practice into a tool of control. And above all, let's rediscover the freedom of a faith that is alive, intelligent, and rooted not in law, but in love. When people refer to tithing as a biblical command, they often overlook one critical question: which Bible? More precisely, which part of the Bible, under which covenant, addressed to whom, and for what purpose? Because when we actually take the time to examine the Old Testament practice of tithing, what we find is not a universal spiritual law, but a very specific system rooted in the political, tribal, and agricultural structure of ancient Israel. In that context, tithing wasn't a moral rule for all people at all times. It was a national tax for a theocratic society. Let's be clear. The tithe in the Old Testament was deeply embedded in the structure of Israel's identity as a nation governed by divine law. It wasn't just about personal generosity, it was about national order. The land was divided among 12 tribes, and one of those tribes, the Levites, were set apart to serve in the temple and had no land of their own. Because they couldn't farm or produce income in the same way, the other tribes were commanded to support them by offering a tenth of their agricultural produce: grain, wine, oil, livestock. This wasn't a donation to a church. It was a redistribution system designed to maintain religious and civil infrastructure in a land-based economy. This is important. Tithing was never about money. It wasn't 10% of income from fishing or carpentry or trading spices. It was produce and livestock from inherited land in a specific geographic region under a covenant between God and the nation of Israel. So if someone wants to insist on tithing today based on that model, they should also be advocating for temple sacrifices, Levitical priests, and a return to tribal land allotments. But of course, they don't. And that inconsistency reveals the selective reading often at play. Now, why does this matter? Because when we extract tithing from its original context and impose it on modern believers, many of whom live paycheck to paycheck in a completely different economic system, we risk turning a cultural artifact into a spiritual weapon. And that's not theology. That's manipulation disguised as doctrine. Psychologically, the implications are significant. When people are taught that God demands 10% of their income, or else He won't bless them, or worse, that they're robbing God if they don't comply. It induces fear, guilt, and spiritual insecurity. That's not what God intended. That's not how healthy relationships work, let alone a relationship with the divine. If love gives freely and God is love, then the kind of giving He desires must be rooted in freedom, not compulsion. So before we ask how much we should give, we need to ask why we give. And if our answer begins with fear or tradition instead of love and understanding, then we're not giving as God intended. We're just participating in a system that never actually had our name on it to begin with. Don't confuse the remnants of an old covenant with the heartbeat of the new one. If tithing was such a non-negotiable principle for believers under the new covenant, then we would expect Jesus to be crystal clear about it. We would expect Paul, Peter, or James, the foundational leaders of the early church, to write at length about the necessity of giving exactly 10% of your income to a religious institution. But they don't. In fact, they're almost completely silent on the matter of tithing as it was understood under the Mosaic law. And that silence is not accidental, it's deeply meaningful. When Jesus does mention tithing, it's in the context of rebuke. He criticizes the Pharisees in Matthew 23 for obsessively tithing spices, mint, dill, and cumin, while neglecting the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That should tell us something immediately. Tithing to Jesus was never the core. It was a surface-level ritual that could be performed while the heart remained distant from what really mattered. He doesn't condemn them for tithing, but he clearly indicates that it is secondary, almost trivial, when compared to the deeper demands of love and integrity. What's more revealing is what Jesus doesn't say. He never commands his disciples or any of the crowds following him to tithe. And when he teaches about money and generosity, the framework shifts dramatically. In Luke 21, he praises a poor widow not for giving 10%, but for giving all she had. In Matthew 6, he instructs his followers to give in secret, not to fulfill a law, but to reflect the hidden posture of a transformed heart. Then we get to the apostolic writings, which are essentially the manual for Christian life after the resurrection. Paul writes extensively about generosity, particularly in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. He urges believers to give, but not under compulsion, not according to a fixed percentage. He uses language like, as you have decided in your heart, and not reluctantly or under pressure. That is a moral and spiritual vision built on freedom, not formula. Now think about that philosophically. If God were merely interested in ensuring his institutions had funding, a flat tax would be the most efficient model. But instead, what we see in the New Testament is an invitation to maturity. God is no longer dealing with people as children under a tutor, but as free moral agents. Giving is not about compliance, it's about character. It's about cultivating the kind of person who gives because they've learned to love, not because they're afraid not to. This shift mirrors a broader psychological movement from external obedience to internal transformation, from law to liberty, from fear to freedom. That's the heartbeat of New Covenant Christianity. And so the question becomes, do you want to live under a system that manages your behavior? Or do you want to become the kind of person who doesn't need one? Because in the end, God is not after your percentage, he's after your heart. One of the most uncomfortable truths about how tithing is taught in modern churches is this. It's often not about spiritual growth, it's about control. And that's a hard thing to say out loud, especially in communities where questioning leadership is equated with rebellion, or where asking for clarity is mistaken for a lack of faith. But the patterns are there if we're willing to see them. Tithing, in many church environments, has become a psychological tool, one used to shape behavior through a subtle mixture of fear, guilt, and incentive. The message is repeated in dozens of variations. If you don't tithe, you're robbing God. If you give your 10%, God will open the windows of heaven and bless you. If you're struggling financially, maybe it's because you haven't been faithful in your giving. These aren't just theological assertions. They're psychological levers, and they're powerful. Why are they powerful? because they tap into some of our most primal motivators: fear of loss, hope for reward, and the deep human need to feel approved and accepted. And when a religious institution positions itself as the mediator of God's blessing, the pressure to comply isn't just external, it becomes internalized. People begin to associate their self-worth, their spiritual maturity, and even their sense of eternal security with whether or not they're tithing correctly. That's not freedom. That's bondage dressed up as obedience. There's a philosophical irony here, and it's worth unpacking. Christianity at its core is about liberation, freedom from the law, from sin, from fear. Christ's message was not, here's another rule book. It was, the truth will set you free. And yet we've taken one practice from an ancient theocratic legal system and built a new law out of it, a law that has become for many a metric of spiritual legitimacy. But the cost of this distortion is high. It damages trust in God by replacing relationship with transaction. It diminishes the concept of grace by making divine favor something to be purchased, and it skews the role of the church, transforming it from a community of mutual care into a kind of spiritual corporation where giving becomes the monthly membership fee. Now, I'm not saying churches shouldn't receive support. They absolutely should. But the health of a church is not measured by how effectively it compels giving through theology. It's measured by how deeply it inspires generosity through love, transparency, and shared mission. Manipulation may produce short-term compliance, but it never produces long-term transformation. So here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Is our giving a reflection of spiritual maturity, or is it a symptom of spiritual pressure? Because if it's the latter, then we're not participating in grace. We're performing under duress. God never asked you to surrender your autonomy. He asked you to surrender your heart. There's a difference, and it's time we started teaching it. There's something profoundly revealing about how we measure spiritual health today. In many church circles, the tithe has become one of the key indicators, almost like a diagnostic tool. If a person gives 10% of their income, they're seen as faithful, mature, trustworthy. If they don't, suspicion often follows. Their commitment is questioned. Their spiritual status becomes uncertain. But we need to ask a deeper question here. What kind of character are we actually producing when we elevate a fixed financial contribution over inner transformation? You can teach someone to tithe without ever teaching them to love. You can coerce giving through shame or promise of reward and never touch the heart. That's not discipleship. That's behavioral conditioning. And when giving is stripped from the soul and reduced to a percentage, it loses its power to transform. It becomes a transaction, a checkbox on a list of spiritual duties. And we have to ask ourselves honestly, is that what Christ had in mind when he taught about generosity? Consider the psychological implications of tying spiritual status to financial contribution. It subtly teaches people that their value in the community is linked to what they give. It fosters a hierarchy of worth. Those who give are celebrated. Those who struggle are pitied or pressured. It breeds comparison, performance, and ultimately burnout. That's not love, it's not grace, and it certainly isn't freedom. We've created a model where many believers are trapped in guilt for not tithing, while others give dutifully but with bitterness, not joy. They've learned to act generous without ever becoming generous in spirit. And that distinction matters immensely, because Christ wasn't just after behavior, he was after the root of behavior. He was after transformation from the inside out. He never measured righteousness by external compliance alone, but by the condition of the heart. What we're dealing with, then, is a deeper philosophical conflict. Are we aiming to build people who are morally automated or morally awake? A tithing culture can produce the former, people who act correctly but think minimally, who follow systems rather than engage in real, costly, heartfelt decision-making. But true discipleship demands the latter. It demands reflection, courage, maturity. It calls people to wrestle with what generosity means for them, in their context, with their limitations and their calling. Paul's teaching on giving in the New Testament supports this. He doesn't lay out a formula, he lays out a vision. He calls people to be cheerful givers, sacrificial givers, generous givers, but never robotic ones, because cheerful giving cannot be commanded, it must be cultivated. So the challenge before us is not simply to reconsider the tithe, it's to reconsider the kind of people we're trying to become. Are we growing into free, generous, thoughtful individuals? Or are we just performing righteousness under the weight of religious expectation? The heart of true giving is not in the percentage, it's in the posture. Let's teach that, because that's where the real transformation begins. So what are we left with after peeling back the layers of tradition, coercion, and misinterpretation? We're left with a stark but liberating truth. God never mandated tithing for New Covenant believers, not once, not through Christ, not through the apostles, and certainly not as a fixed standard to measure our spiritual value or unlock divine favor. That idea that giving is transactional, that we pay a spiritual tax to remain in good standing with God, is a distortion of the gospel. And it's one that has quietly shaped the internal world of countless believers, often leaving them with guilt, fear, and confusion, instead of freedom, peace, and clarity. But we need to go beyond just correcting the theology. We need to ask why this matters, why this conversation reaches into something so deeply human. Because at its core, this isn't just about money. It's about trust. It's about the kind of relationship we believe God wants to have with us. Is it a relationship based on leverage and obligation, or one grounded in love, freedom, and maturity? The truth is, God is not trying to extract from you, He's trying to form you. That's a fundamentally different aim. And once you understand that, everything begins to shift. You stop asking, what do I have to give? And start asking, what am I being invited to give in light of who I'm becoming? That's the kind of question that leads to actual transformation, not just in your bank account, but in your character. So if you've been giving out of fear, stop. If you've withheld out of resentment, forgive. And if you've never questioned the system, start now. Not to rebel, not to withhold, but to grow, to mature, to move from obedience rooted in fear to generosity rooted in freedom. Because God doesn't want your 10%, He wants your whole heart. And that's something no formula can ever measure.